So thanks everyone for coming to our seminar series. Today, very lucky to have Marit from the school talking about do Australians care about carbon farming and its co-benefits. So Marit's going to talk for about 35 minutes, I'm assuming, or
about 15, 20.
15, 20? Awesome, early lunch.
So Jumbo just suggested that I'm missing a semicolon. Where can I put the semicolon?
A question.
I have the question mark.
No. A question, semicolon, do Australians care about
carbon farming, semicolon, do Australians care about it?
Yeah, that's it.
Carbon farming code. There's our paper type.
Because thanks, we didn't have the... So Fiona's helping me write a paper on this together with Carrie and Fleur from UQ. So I'm talking about carbon farming today, and I'm guessing that most of you already know what carbon farming is. So let me just see a show of hands. Who knows about carbon farming and the Carbon Farming Initiative? Only about half. So that's good. So I might actually be saying something new to people. So I was a bit worried that this is going to be a bit boring for people. So the carbon farming is a greenhouse gas climate change mitigation policy. Australia has committed, even the current government has committed to reducing Australia's greenhouse gas pollution. It's one of the greatest emitters, especially per capita, is one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. And you will find, especially overseas, a lot of focus on agriculture as one of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Cows, burp, methane, land conversion causes increased greenhouse gases. But agriculture can also be part of the solution to climate change. And especially by sequestering, so storing carbon in soils, soil organic carbon, and in vegetation, so in crops or in permanent vegetation. And that's an option that the Australian government is pursuing. Things that farmers can do to either reduce their emissions or increase their carbon storage are things like planting trees, going into tree farming or planting tree belts along their paddocks, conservation tillage, which most Western Australian farmers already do. So conservation tillage is not ploughing your soil when you seed. Grazing and livestock management, there's certain types of, like rotational grazing can increase soil carbon. Improve your fertilizer management, not wasting fertilizer and optimizing fertilizer use for increased crop growth, because increased crop growth will sequester carbon in the soils through the root systems. And then there's stuff like biofuels and, like I said, perennial crops. So the previous government started looking into this and thought about ways to stimulate farmers to adopt some of those practices that I stated before. And they thought of this policy, which was not called the Carbon Farming Initiative, part of the Carbon Farming Futures Plan, that gives farmers access to carbon offset markets, to the voluntary carbon offset markets. And the policy says that if you take up certain practices, and those practices are defined by the government, you can sell the carbon you store, or the emissions you don't emit, as carbon credits, which in the voluntary offset market, companies like aviation companies can buy those offset credits. And with the new emission reduction fund, I actually looked this up yesterday to make sure that I'm not saying anything wrong. With the coalition's direct action plan is planning to continue this carbon farming initiative in a slightly different setup, but the idea remains the same. So what does the carbon farming initiative target? It's basically two things. It's either storing carbon in soils or vegetation, which I call carbon. It's called carbon sequestration. Sequestration is storage, or avoiding emissions. So emissions from livestock burping, manure management, and burning. And you will see at the next slide that avoiding burning is actually one of the biggest buyers of carbon offsets. So the process is that farmers suggest activities to the government and say, well, if we're going to do this, can we get carbon credits for these things? And the government has a committee, the Domestic Offset Integrity Committee, that looks at all these activities and thinks about whether it's worthwhile to offer carbon credits for those activities. And then it's a long process that goes from activities into methodologies, which means that it becomes law, and only after that can the farmer actually gain credits. And things that are currently creditable are increased environmental plantings, that's forest areas, reduced emissions from burning savannas, so just not burning your savanna or early burning, so that the grass isn't as high and don't get as many emissions. Reducing emissions from piggeries and dairy farming, so that's the intensive livestock, and also reducing landfill. So there is this site called MyCFI that shows the different projects that are currently registered in Australia, and this means landfill. This is a planting, and the top one, the red fire pit, is the savanna burning. Most, as you might see from the colors, most projects that are currently credited are these landfill, reducing landfill emissions, and reduced savanna burning, and a couple of plantings. Now, when this whole process started about carbon farming and the benefits for climate change mitigation, I thought about the other benefits that carbon farming could potentially have. So first of all, of course, we do carbon farming because we want to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations. But some of these projects may have co-benefits that are currently not incorporated in the policy. Like if we plant native vegetation or environmental plantings, there might be a biodiversity benefit. If we change our soil management for increased soil carbon, it has other benefits for soil health, like reduced erosion, higher soil organic matter will increase productivity. It may have a range of co-benefits. And that made me think about, well, what exactly are the economic costs and the benefits of carbon farming, different carbon farming practices, first of all to the farmers. So what does it cost them to undertake these measures, and how much benefit does it give them, if any? Like if it has any productive benefits, there's a very clear benefit, but there may also be cost. And especially in the case of native vegetation and increased biodiversity, it's not the farmer himself or herself that directly benefits, but it's more of a wider societal public good that will be provided. And we haven't really looked at what the public benefits are of carbon farming, other than reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So that second question is what I want to talk about today. And we Michael helped me with the research on estimating. We used a choice experiment study to estimate what Australian people, public in Australia, thinks about different co-benefits of carbon farming and how high they value those different benefits. So, like I said, we did this study using a choice experiment, and I'm gonna assume that everyone by now is familiar with what a choice experiment is, and it was a fairly basic choice experiment that we did last year, with 3 alternatives, with the third alternative being a we're not going to do anything alternative, and alternative 1 and 2 was always a we're going to support more carbon farming alternative. And those carbon farming scenarios had different impacts. So that's in the in the leftmost column. They had impacts on carbon reduction, so either carbon emissions or carbon storage. They had impacts on native vegetation, so if you plant monoculture trees or an environmental planting might have a difference in vegetation. We had a soil health attribute, soil erosion, and then we had annual cost. So the idea was that people would need to pay for increased climate change mitigation. So using this method, we can analyze what the trade-offs are that people make between these different attributes. And usually, choice experiments are done to estimate willingness to pay. So the trade-offs that people are willing to make between the cost and environmental attributes. But another thing that I wanted to do with this study is look at the trade-offs that people make between different co-benefits. So maybe would they value native vegetation higher than greenhouse gas emissions? Or is greenhouse gas emissions the most important thing? Oh, that's not what I wanted. So like I said, trade-offs between environmental attributes. Now before I go on, are there any questions about this method?
So which actually alternative first? What that could be?
What's the
In
question?
this example, what could be the first alternative? Just hypothetical, we don't connect to any some specific.
I didn't. They were just presented with alternative 1, alternative 2.
They don't know what it is
And
in reality. Is it like
well, the list that I showed you in one of the earlier slides is the list that respondents saw as well. There's a variety of projects we can undertake. Can be either manure management or planting vegetation, and we're looking at combinations of those.
Just a quick question. Your net cost to households, what exactly is that?
I have to say I don't remember. Was it a tax?
Some sort of tax.
Do you remember?
Some sort of tax.
Yeah.
I mean, an issue for me is, if I was looking at that as a respondent, you're not really capturing the opportunity cost. For example, alternative 2, if I'm providing 1.8 million hectares of native vegetation, the opportunity cost of that may be for agricultural income on that 1.8 million.
Yep. But then you're probably an exception to the normal respondent who doesn't really think about.
you're just weird or something?
No, I think all of us are weird if you compare us to the average person.
Those $300 might include that.
Yeah, that's my question.
So, but there's two different things there. There's one which is you reduce agricultural output, therefore prices go up, and that's going to have impact on your costs.
Prices
So
go
then
up.
it's not
Food
a tax
prices
then.
go up, and therefore that's why we're getting. Is that what you meant? In terms of the increased cost was due.
Let's not have this discussion now because otherwise I'm going to lose my train of thought.
Can I ask a question though?
No.
It's being recorded.
Let's save the questions for afterwards. I just had I just asked whether you understood. You did understand. Anyway, that's the method we used. I can't change it anymore. Yeah, indeed. And I actually used 4 different split samples. One split sample I had to throw out because it just doesn't work. Anyway, I have done all the analysis on the data, did estimated multinomial logit models. It's all econometric modeling. So I'll tell you what models I tested. Michael will be the only one who understands. Multinomial logit models, nested models, mixed logit models, latent class models. And I'm going to show you 2 of my results, the multinomial logit model and the mixed class logit model. And I like the mixed and the logit models because they can account for the panel format of the data. So one respondent saw, I think, 5 choice sets a lot of modeling approaches don't account for the fact that one person makes 5 choices. They just treat each choice individually. I like these models that can account for that panel, and I like the mixed models because they account for the fact that preferences between people are heterogeneous, so they vary between people. If you have a multinomial model, which is what the original logit model is, you just estimate, where's my cursor, you estimate one beta, so one parameter, which is the same for every individual. But from a mixed logit model, you estimate one parameter with some deviation between individuals. That's all the modeling that I'm going to talk about. Results. We completed a total of, I think it was about 1,400 surveys, but like I said, one split sample didn't work, threw that out, and I ended up with 929 respondents. And we asked them a whole range of questions, not just the choice experiment, but also questions about, do you care about environment? Do you care about climate change? Socio-demographic variables. And this is a question that I like putting up because you will see it will affect willingness to pay. So we asked people whether they believe that climate change is happening. And as you can see, there is about a bit less than 5% of our respondents thought that climate change was a lot of crap, and it's not happening. Not entirely sure whether that's representative for the Australian population, but it makes me feel good that we're a lot lower than the US. Then there is a few people who have no idea. There is nearly a quarter of my respondents who think that climate change is happening, but it's all natural. And then the rest of people think that climate change is happening and humans are at least contributing to it. And I used that climate change opinion, to explain their attitudes towards the different environmental attributes by interacting it with the environmental attributes. So when reading this result, I'll go through the columns with you. First, I want to show you the very simple multinomial logit model results. So this is with the 900 something respondents. Model worked really well. I had an alternative specific constant, which was 1 for that we don't take any action, and the sign on the ASC was negative, which means that people like carbon farming, or at least the impacts of carbon farming. They had a negative value on costs, which makes sense. Higher cost reduces your welfare. They had positive coefficients for native vegetation and carbon storage, so they gained some utility from increased native vegetation and increased carbon storage. But soil erosion was not significant, so no number there. And we can discuss later why that might be the case. And then, like I said, I interacted socio-demographics with the environmental attributes to see how opinions might differ between different people. And climate change opinion was the one that was most important. So again, I'm using the mouse so that if people look at this at home, they can see what I'm doing. Here I've interacted cost with climate change opinion, and the sign was positive. So what that means is that people who more believe that climate change is happening and that it's caused by humans didn't have such a disutility from cost as people who thought climate change wasn't happening or that it was natural. Another interaction with cost that was significant, which I thought was rather funny, is people in Queensland and WA had a higher disutility from cost than people in New South Wales and Victoria. So Queenslanders, Western Australians care more about the costs than the New South Wales and the Victorian respondents. Then the other climate change opinion interactions that were significant was actually significant with every environmental attribute. So interaction with native vegetation was positive, which means it was positive with all environmental attributes, which means that the more people believed in human-induced climate change, the more positive they were towards more environmental attributes or higher levels of environmental attributes. And age was significant when interacting with carbon storage, which means that older people didn't value carbon storage as highly as younger people. So that's all pretty plausible to me.
So did you rank the climate change opinion from 1 to 5?
No, it was effects coded.
All right.
So what does that mean? You've got,
So
I have no idea. No, I've got no idea, or it's natural as 0. It's not happening as -1, and it's happening and it's at least partly induced by humans as 1. On your advice. There you go. Before you want to say anything else? But let's look at this model, which I think is the better, well, not I think, it is the better model. It's this random parameter model, which accounts for preference heterogeneity between people. Which makes sense to me, you know? People have different preferences. And when we estimated that model, it's actually fairly similar in terms of results to the multinomial logit model. Positive preferences for vegetation and carbon, negative for cost, and again, soil erosion was not significant. So there's something going on with that attribute that either people didn't relate to, people didn't understand, or people just don't really care about. I don't know what that is. This model worked much better, so I'm going to use this model to estimate willingness to pay. So for those of you who don't know, willingness to pay expresses the trade-offs that people are willing to make between the environmental attributes and costs. And
you didn't do the interactions for that one?
I did, but I couldn't report them all. But as you can see in the willingness to pay results, I did, and I calculated them. So I estimated willingness to pay using those interaction terms, and then just setting the other sociodemographic variables to the mean of my sample. And because there was a difference between different groups of people with different opinions to climate change, I looked at differences in willingness to pay between those groups. And because erosion was not significant, I didn't calculate any willingness to pay for those. So what you see is that I never really know how to interpret these numbers exactly. To me, choice experiments willingness to pay results give an indication of values rather than this is the value. What you mostly see is that indeed, you know, people who believe in human-induced climate change have a higher willingness to pay for native vegetation in dollars per hectare, and a higher willingness to pay for carbon storage than people who don't think it's caused by humans or who don't believe climate change is happening at all. You might say, whoa, those 95% confidence intervals are really big. Well, that is because I used a random parameter model, which means there's not one mean preference, there's actually a distribution of preferences, and I used that distribution of preferences to calculate my willingness to pay estimates. If anyone ever shows you a random parameter model and highly significant willingness to pay estimates, question how they calculated their willingness to pay, because I'm going to guess they used the standard error of their mean rather than the standard deviation. That's as an aside. So you can see that there's quite a wide range of preferences for people. Oh, let's get back to this in the discussion. I don't really know what to say about these things other than dollars per metric ton of carbon is really low. People are willing to pay on average a little bit less, a little bit over $1. So who knows what the carbon price per metric ton of CO2 equivalence is at the moment? I was thinking Kai should know.
You mean the Australian price?
25.
Around 25.
Yeah, so around 25, people are willing to pay about a little bit over $1. There's a bit of a discrepancy there. You can see that native vegetation is quite appealing. Although I don't know how much that would compare to costs of planting vegetation. Didn't look that up. What I did do is I looked at, so we can calculate this willingness to pay by the coefficient between attributes and cost. But we can also look at the marginal rates of substitutions between attributes. So I did that for carbon storage and native vegetation. And you can do that very simply by dividing the coefficients. And what I found is that people are willing to trade off about 10.7 metric ton of CO2 for every additional hectare of native vegetation. And we, when Fiona and Louise and myself went to this to a workshop in Brisbane in March it was, we discussed this result at length with ecologists. And I'm still not entirely sure what to make of this. At first I thought, oh, well, that makes sense. So what we need to do is we need to calculate how much CO2 is sequestered by, just one species, maybe a plantation forest. And then we need to calculate how much CO2 is sequestered by an environmental planting. Look at the difference and see whether the possible decrease in CO2 emissions is offset by the increase in native vegetation. So that's what I did in this with the FullCam model, which is a CSIRO model that calculates how much CO2 is sequestered by different types of plantings. And that FullCam model says, well, if you plant a single species mallee plantation, it will store somewhere between 11 and 30 metric ton of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year, depending on where you plant, soil quality and stuff. If you plant environmental plantings, either shrubs or trees, they will sequester between 7 and 11 metric ton of CO2 equivalents. So that told me that, so if I have single species planting that is not very productive, it's actually worthwhile planting environmental plantings, because they might not sequester as much metric ton of CO2, but you get additional native vegetation, and that you get more than 10.7 versus 1 trade-offs there. But my ecologist said, well, native vegetation, mallee trees are also native. Mm-hmm. So what do you mean by native vegetation? Do people think about environmental vegetation and biodiverse vegetation, or did they just think of a one tree belt or forestry plantation? And that's where I got stuck, because we showed them photos of the environmental plantings and we described the native vegetation as environmental plantings. But technically, native vegetation can also be a single species mallee planting. So if any of you has any advice on whether we can use this result, not throw it out, or how to use this result, it would be much appreciated. So, last slide is that, remember that I used the interaction between WA and Queensland people and New South Wales and Victorian people and cost. The result of that was that the willingness to pay of Western Australians and Queenslanders for carbon mitigation is lower than in New South Wales and Victoria. Remember that I calculated average willingness to pay for carbon storage, 1.13, which is much lower than the carbon price. And I'm showing that there is some trade-off that people make between native vegetation and carbon storage, about 10 to 1. And that's the main messages that I wanted you to take away. So been able to stretch it to a half an hour after all.
Fabulous, thank you.
Suggestion on the last one, I'd take it back to a focus group and show them the photos of the environmental plannings and ask them, you know, would they think of native vegetation as a monoculture species? So there's no reason why you can't do a focus group after the survey like you did one before.
Yeah, well, I did one before, and that's why we chose native vegetation, because it was the best. You know, people could relate to native vegetation when I tried to describe biodiversity. So how do I describe biodiversity? Oh, that's native veg.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, so you can just confirm that in another focus group in
Just
the
don't use
future.
Mali. Just don't use Mali in your analysis.
Well, that's full cam.
No, just you can yeah, don't talk about Mali.
So if you
Yeah.
Like native vegetation versus something which is not vegetation at all, not plant.
Yeah.
How did you go with the soil erosion in the focus group? I was really curious about that.
Yeah, we talked about, I'm not sure if I have the photo that actually showed them. No, not by the looks of it. But we talked about soil health, so that's the third one. Improved soil health, which is important obviously for farmers in terms of their production. And
But this is a public survey, isn't it?
but we thought, well, what's the public good that's related to soil health? And we couldn't
Mainly be river water quality in places where the erosion gets into waterways.
Yeah, and
But that's not everywhere.
but that's not everywhere. That's why we went back to erosion, because erosion.
Well, erosion ends up in rivers if you're near a river.
Yeah, and if you're not near a river, you might see the erosion. You might see the runoff from. And I did three focus groups, and the consensus was that erosion was probably the best way to capture soil quality, next to productivity. But productivity is a market good, so I didn't want to use that. But after doing the survey and people not reacting to erosion, I think you can conclude that erosion is just not an attribute that people can relate to compared to native vegetation and carbon.
Yeah, it's not something on the news, so.
And it's also the way we showed it was, how much soil is lost per year. Don't really know what that means. At least it meant carbon. We related it to how much soil is currently lost through erosion processes. We related the carbon in our descriptions to how much carbon is currently emitted. We related native vegetation to the current amount of native vegetation in Australia. So that
20 or 30 years ago, it might have been different because there was a lot of erosion and dust storms and roads being blocked by sand and stuff.
Yeah.
But Mintel's fixed that almost every year.
Yeah, I think it's just an outcome of the survey, I guess, that soil erosion is not something that.
Was there a different response in Queensland? I'm just thinking there with the cyclonic and flooding activity with runoff affecting the barrier reef. That was more visible to those respondents.
No, that I tested all those interactions, and that the only interaction was between cost and Queensland.
So again, I'm looking at this question, and there is no way they would assume non-native vegetation from this question. So you cannot compare native vegetation with non-native vegetation from your results. So mean, the respondent, they don't see non-native vegetation on this graph. So the first alternative, for example, second alternative has native vegetation increase. But first one, it might be non-native vegetation, pine plantation only, or it might be not. So you cannot compare native vegetation with non-native.
No, really, what you're comparing is nothing versus native vegetation.
Yes, but you cannot
not
assume that there could be non-native vegetation or like monocultures. So you,
But the problem is that
But
the
then-
monoculture that's going in is a native vegetation. Is native vegetation.
No, what Maxim is saying is something else. But if the alternative,
if you put monoculture as another line, then you could compare monoculture versus
Yeah.
native.
yeah, but that's
In
not
this
what we're
case-
comparing. We're comparing
The outcome of the strategy.
carbon sequestration versus native vegetation.
Yes,
Which you can do.
but you cannot put Mali as comparison with like.
Well,
Strictly, it's a native vegetation.
You can.
So therefore, you can.
Yeah.
It's a question about whether the
But you
response.
cannot you cannot compare.
no, but let's think of another pine forest.
You cannot compare. You assume that it is from the point of native vegetation. It could be could be same. It should be
There
same.
could
grade
be
as-
an increase in mallee plantations as well.
Yeah.
So, and you're missing that bit.
Yeah.
In comparison between
Well, you
mallees
can't
and
tell whether
native.
they're thinking
So
about it.
all you can say is there's this trade-off. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm developing my thoughts. Let's have one more question. Are we sure we want Michael?
You've got 4 treatments.
Yes.
One, you didn't say which one dropped out, but there's no reason why the other 3 aren't having an impact. You didn't. What are the 4 treatments?
Are there only different follow-up questions in terms of attribute non-attendance?
So which one failed?
The one with they would have to click.
Hit the button. And so in terms of the choice sets, there's no difference in terms of what they saw
No.
in terms of the treatments. It was all ex post. Was it worth it? My question.
Alright, we'll wrap it up. And I think we start back again at the start of August.